Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin, our slow pub crawl through my Penguin classics, my substitution for a normal shelf tour where I would have been pulling down a whole shelf of books, a dozen at a time. Instead, we're going book by book and author by author, in what Hannah at Hannah's Books refers to as my March of the Penguins. and as we have seen lately with my March of the Penguins, this is still a protracted shelf tour. Just because we're doing this one book or author at a time doesn't mean that I'm editing. So, in other words, into every Daily Penguin, a little rain must fall. And that's what we're encountering today. It's a horrible shock to take you from Horace to this next author. Nevertheless, we will go through my penguins, penguin by penguin. And up next, we go to ancient Greece. We go to 384 BC. We go to the birth of Aristotle. Now, here we have the Penguin Classic Ethics and the Penguin Classic The Politics. The Ethics is translated by J.A.K. Thompson, and the Politics is translated by T.A. Sinclair. These are both mass-market paperbacks, but Penguin Classic has done a lot more Aristotle than this, a lot more. These are just the two volumes that I have. These are all the Penguin Classic Aristotle that I have. Here we have a fresco and a good cover. So once again, we're seeing both sides of Penguin design. And, well, what can I say about this author, the so-called father of philosophers? What can I say about him that hasn't been not said by 1,000 fans of his? He was world famous for being the mentor of Alexander the Great, the tutor of Alexander the Great. And when he left Alexander, he came back to Athens and set up a school, the Lyceum, that was famous and drew people from all over because he was the heir to Plato. He was the heir to Plato's Academy, to the foremost and most talked about and most storied philosophical school of ancient Greece. It was only the right at the very end of his life that Aristotle sort of fell from favor for his pro-Macedonian associations and had to leave Athens. We don't have to dwell on that, especially when we have his enormous literary corpus to deal with. We have a lot of Aristotle, a lot. A lot of it was recopied even in the ancient world. It was annotated and re-edited and duplicated many, many, many times. So we have a large amount of Aristotle. Penguin does a lot of them. Also, Everyman Library has a beautiful, I don't know if they still make it, but at one time they had a beautiful, big, fat trade paperback of an enormous amount of Aristotle, the kind of thing that Penguin doesn't do. As far as I know, Penguin has never done a gigantic 800-page volume of Aristotle. And we have politics and ethics and aesthetics and morals. We have all these things from Aristotle. And I first encountered this author fresh from the Dialogues of Plato, which likewise have all sorts of philosophical underpinnings, all sorts of major philosophical metaphysical subjects are examined, but entertainingly enough so that I read those and thought, well, all right, this isn't my cup of tea, but this was by no means a root canal to read, and I went to Aristotle straight from that. And oh my, what a different experience it is, because Aristotle, as far as I can tell, is the very first author to commit and codify the 3 cardinal sins of professional philosophy. Plato doesn't do it, but Aristotle does. The first one of those, the first thing you notice when you go from Plato to Aristotle, whether you're going in the Greek or, in my opinion, any English translation, these are worthy English translations, but there's only so much you can do. The first cardinal sin of philosophy is to remove readability. Plato doesn't do that. Plato is extremely readable. He has personalities talking with each other. He has personal settings. In fact, he's so readable that sometimes it works against him. Sometimes he's too readable for his own good. Like, for instance, in the concept of Atlantis, the lost continent of Atlantis, which Plato, I hope you're all listening, just plain made up. He just plain made it up. He invented it the way Thomas More invented Utopia. He invented it. There was no classical tradition of Atlantis. It starts and stops with Plato. He made it up. despite an entire cottage industry of people hunting for it, claiming they found it, describing what its society was like in real life, really, not just philosophically. But all of that readability, the personality of Socrates, the personality of all the different interlocutors, the personality of Alcibiades, all of that disappears with Aristotle. He didn't need it. In his opinion, he didn't need it. So he commits that sin. The sin number one, the cardinal sin of philosophy number one, is he gets rid of readability. The second cardinal sin of philosophy, that as far as I can tell he's the first one to commit, is to get rid of common sense. Just discard it completely. So that instead you can have inquiries. They always term it an inquiry. So that you can have inquiries into things that any child understands. And if you raise enough rhetorical hullabaloo about it, you can start to convince the weaker-willed adults that listen to you that maybe it is complicated. Maybe they don't really understand it. So what does it mean for a rock to be hard? Are rocks really hard? What about some rocks being less hard than others? Are you saying that aren't there rocks you would prefer to fall upon than others? If that's true, then by infinite regress, can't we say that some rocks aren't hard at all? No, you can't. Rocks are hard. Or what is up? Can we really say what that is? What is up? If you were inverted, wouldn't up change? Shouldn't we have a long dialectic? Shouldn't we have an inquiry about what up is? No, we shouldn't. No. Should have an inquiry into hard or soft, bright or dim, up or down, right or wrong, pain or pleasure. We should have an inquiry into any of these things. They are absolutely self-evident, but the second cardinal sin of philosophy is to get rid of common sense. So that if you can palaver about something, well, then it's worth palavering about. That is not true. But Aristotle's the first one to really weaponize that, and he's also guilty to an enormous degree of the third cardinal sin of philosophy, which flows naturally from the first two. If you remove readability, you say, I no longer need to be readable. And if you remove common sense, so you say, well, can we really say that fire is hot? Surely the sun is much hotter than a fire at your campsite. Surely, by comparison with the sun, the fire at your campsite would be cool. No, the fire at your campsite is still hot. Okay, fire is still hot. But the second cardinal sin of philosophy, after remove readability, is remove common sense. So let's dissect and have a quote-unquote inquiry about things we all understand. And if you're an arrogant philosopher, and there is no other kind, we just lost one, but I guarantee you there are plenty of new arrogant philosophers waiting in the wings. The arrogant philosophers will say, well, pityingly, dawnishly, looking down on you, they will say, oh, so you think these things are self-evident, do you? Well, I remember when I was like that in my pre-conscious days. To which those of us in South Boston have a ready rejoinder. It's an urging to tell that person to go and do something to themselves, but I will not repeat it on this channel. But the third cardinal sin of professional philosophy flows from the first two. If you remove readability and you remove common sense, then the third thing comes naturally, which is to remove concision. If you're no longer bound by common sense or by readability, both of which take work and both of which eliminate pages rather than add them. If you're no longer bound by either one of those things, then of course the works you produce will be freaking-enormous, as we have seen. All you have to do is look at most of the absolute pillars of professional philosophy in the last 200 years. Aside from Camus, are there any skinny ones? Look at Wittgenstein, for God's sake. Look at Jean-Paul Sartre. It's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. And so on and so forth. I mean, they are not the only offenders. And it's Aristotle that brought all three of those together, where I am going to blather on and on in the most boring prose imaginable about the most self-evident things. And I'm going to cloak it all in a pseudo-profundity that's going to leave you wondering whether or not you're missing out, whether or not you're in a cave looking at shadows. And that's what you get from Aristotle. I encountered that and was appalled. Absolutely appalled. there were times in my less charitable youth when I thought that the poobahs of Athens were being too generous, letting him skulk off into exile. They should have tossed him off a rock, and his works with him. But I thought that maybe in a quirk of writing, I was seeing that wrong. So then I went to English translations of Aristotle. I've read many, many English translations of Aristotle, always looking for anything that is readable, anything that makes sense. No. And anything also that is brief or concise or witty or anything like that. And it's not. There's nothing there. Nothing at all. I'm here to tell you, you may have to read Aristotle. You almost certainly do, considering the huge shadow that he casts on literature as well as philosophy. You may have to read him, but you are not going to enjoy him. In English or any other language, you are not going to enjoy him. He is tedious beyond the measure of man. But is he really tedious? Surely writing a book consisting of 1,000 pages of the same word typed over and over again would be the peak of tedium. And if that's the peak of tedium, can we really say that the ethics of Aristotle? Yeah, we can. Yeah, we can. So zip it. These subjects can be discussed in an interesting way. Plato does it. Xenophon does it. It can happen. What we have here is that you're just in the grip of a boring author. So that is your Daily Penguin for today. This is all the Aristotle I have, a tiny little sliver of the whole. And this is too much. This is too much. The only reason that I have these is because it feels a little wrong to have no Aristotle anywhere except in anthologies. But that is your Daily Penguin for today. It's boring old Aristotle. We're gonna be well shot of him, and as a reward for you getting this far, I will intentionally. We are going penguin by penguin, shelf by shelf, but there's still a little bit of leeway. I will intentionally pick an interesting author for tomorrow, so don't you worry. We'll go back to something interesting to talk about then, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.